Just what was Reconstruction? Literally, Reconstruction means rebuilding, and after the American Civil War, there's a lot of rebuilding to do. For one thing, the South had to literally be rebuilt after the physical destruction of the Civil War. The Southern economy had to be rebuilt. Often you'll hear about the New South Creed, or the belief that the Southern economy should be rebuilt with a greater emphasis on industry than before. And of course, the Union itself had to be rebuilt. The northern and southern states that had been divided during the war would need to be pieced back together. And finally, Southern society would need to be rebuilt or reconstructed without slavery. This would be a huge change. Notice that different people's definitions varied. They had different ideas about what Reconstruction should mean. For one thing, presidential Reconstruction tended to be more moderate or conservative than Congressional Reconstruction. First of all, President Lincoln, even before the war ended, and then his successor, Andrew Johnson, had a fairly lenient attitude towards the South. They wanted general amnesty, easy pardons for most Confederates. You can read about Lincoln's 10% plan, where only 10% of a state's voters would be required to take a loyalty oath before being readmitted to the Union. Lincoln and Johnson both vetoed more radical congressional measures. Radical Republicans in Congress, such as Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, wanted to make it more difficult for former Confederate states to be readmitted into the Union. On the one hand, they can be viewed as being vindictive, wanting to get even with the South. But on the other hand, they also had a more ambitious vision for the way in which Reconstruction could build a new South for the freedmen. You'll read about the Wade-Davis Bill, which Lincoln responded to with a pocket veto. You'll read about the Freedmen's Bureau, which was an attempt to ease the transition from slavery for the freedmen. You'll read about land reform. This was a radical idea, but as it turned out, for most Americans, it was too radical to be implemented. And then there was military occupation of the South. The former Confederate states were divided into military districts. You'll read about President Johnson's impeachment. And finally, by 1870, all the former Confederate states were restored to the Union. By this time, Reconstruction had brought about 3 constitutional amendments that we need to consider. This will help us see what Reconstruction meant for the freedmen. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted the rights of citizenship to the freedmen. The 15th Amendment went a step farther and stated that a freedman could not be denied the right to vote based on the color of their skin or previous condition of servitude. These are radical changes, but as we'll see, Southerners worked hard to minimize the impact of these amendments. Their job would be easier after the year 1877, which marked the end of Reconstruction. For one thing, under the Grant administration, there was corruption, several scandals that were distracting the nation, and also there were economic problems in the North. Many Northerners who were already frustrated with the limited success of Reconstruction were eager to abandon it already. And with the disputed presidential election of 1877, it ended up being settled by compromise in Congress. In exchange for the South accepting a Republican president, Hayes, instead of Tilden, the Democrat, the federal government would remove the last of troops from the South, basically ending Reconstruction for all practical purposes. This made it easier for the Redeemer Democrats to take back the South to a great extent, socially, politically, and economically. How exactly did they do that? First of all, how did they find a way around the 13th Amendment? Obviously, slavery was abolished. There was no turning back. But Southern states began passing black codes, which limited the rights of the freedmen. For example, there were black codes against freedmen carrying weapons when it was okay for their white neighbors to do so. If a black man were caught loitering on the street without a job, he could be arrested, and guess what his punishment might be? He could be assigned to a chain gang, forced to work on a plantation, much like during slavery. And then there was sharecropping. This was a very common practice in the South, especially for freedmen and also for poor whites. Once set free, former slaves didn't have their own land. They were starting out with nothing. How would they find a livelihood? Well, often they signed a contract with a plantation owner, often the former slave owners, agreeing to work a portion of their land in exchange for a share of the crop. This is how they would pay their rent. But also keep in mind, since they were starting out with nothing, they not only had to rent someone else's land, but they also had to borrow for all their other needs. Food, clothing, housing, and so on. Very often sharecroppers found themselves going deeper and deeper and deeper in debt with each year. Much like slavery. Technically, slavery was no longer in place, but a form of economic slavery very quickly replaced it. The 14th Amendment had guaranteed rights of citizenship, but we know that with Jim Crow segregation, the freedmen certainly did not enjoy all the same rights as white Southerners. And in 1896, the Supreme Court upheld separate but equal. They defended segregation. In Plessy v. Ferguson, they ruled that separate but equal was acceptable. And then the 15th Amendment. Notice that I said it provided that freedmen could not be denied the right to vote based on the color of their skin or previous condition of servitude. That's not the same as guaranteeing the right to vote. Very quickly, Southern states began passing laws to restrict the franchise without saying anything about skin color. For example, poll taxes. With a poll tax in place, you would have to pay a tax before you could exercise the right to vote. Technically, does that have anything to do with skin color? No, but it's clear that this was designed to keep freedmen away from the polls, because who was the least able to pay the tax? The freedmen, who very often had nothing. Literacy tests were another way of keeping freedmen from exercising the right to vote. They would be required to take a literacy test proving that they were literate, and these laws didn't have to say anything about skin color. The freedmen were the least likely to be literate. Remember that under slavery it was illegal to teach a slave to read and write. But keep in mind that such measures could also keep many poor white Southerners away from the polls. Not all white Southerners could afford a poll tax, and not all white Southerners were literate. These Redeemer Democrats needed to find a loophole to their own loophole to ensure that poor white Southerners, who were their political supporters, could continue to vote for them, but the freedmen, who tended to vote for Republicans, would not vote. This is where the grandfather clause came in. Under a grandfather clause, you can be grandfathered in under the old system. Again, without referring to skin color, the grandfather clause allowed white Southerners to continue voting because they had previously been able to vote. This didn't help freedmen because they were not grandfathered in. Before, they were not able to vote. In addition to these measures, intimidation itself kept many freedmen away from the polls. Groups such as the KKK did much to intimidate them. Lynching became quite a problem. And white Republicans also were targeted by this intimidation. Scalawags, this was a nickname given to native Southerners who were seen as traitors for being Republican. And then there were also the carpetbaggers from the North. When we consider the legacy of Reconstruction, we can see the glass is half full or half empty, because in some ways it was successful and in other ways it failed. Look at these amendments: abolishing slavery, rights of citizenship, the right to vote. These are important changes. However, as we've seen, there were many ways in which their impact was minimized. Think about the Black Code, sharecropping, segregation, poll taxes, intimidation. It's partly a matter of perspective. How radical was Reconstruction? I'm sure that if you were to ask a radical Republican, he would tell you that it wasn't nearly as radical as it should have been, that he wanted it to do much more. If you were to ask a former slave owner, you would likely be told that Reconstruction was way too radical, that it did much more than it should have done. If you were to ask a freedman about the legacy of Reconstruction, you might get mixed results. Those who were living the life of a sharecropper might say that although they were glad to have their freedom, in many ways their lives hadn't changed that much. If you were to ask a freedman who moved to the west or moved to the north or moved from the rural south into a city, you might get a different response.